Hello and welcome to Candid Convos, the first of a series of conversations brought to you by the Committee for Race, Equity, and Social Justice at Los Angeles City College. I'm Dylan Shields. I'm a professor here at the Cinema and Television Department and a member of the RESJ Committee. Our goal with this series is to facilitate free and open conversations around sensitive, difficult topics with the goal of creating a more equitable world. I remember years ago in a class I was teaching, I began a conversation about race, and though it was very positive, it became a little heated. Afterwards, a student had told me, "You can't talk about race at LACC, people can't handle it." Well, I disagree. I think that in order to make progress in this very polarized, divisive world we live in today, we can't shy away from challenging and uncomfortable topics. We want to stimulate thinking among our campus community and to foster creative solutions to these challenges we all face. We'll be talking about things like race, social inequities, and intersectionality. These topics are often charged and people may tend to potentially shy away from them. It's important to know that these are things that everyone has different lived experiences with. We all have different lived experiences and we may have opinions that go in all different directions. We must recognize that all experiences are valid, even if they differ from yours. Just because we all have our one lived experience doesn't mean we can't listen to others, empathize with them, and put ourselves in other situations. You may feel like you're not qualified to speak on something, but you can listen to others and you can learn. Just because you haven't experienced something doesn't mean you can't relate to it and connect to it, and then when you're ready, you can share that experience with others. For example, I acknowledge that I'm a white, middle-class, cisgendered male. However, this doesn't mean that my life experience is exactly what you may be thinking when I say those descriptors. You wouldn't know just by looking at me that I grew up on a remote Native American reservation and that my entire worldview has been heavily shaped by that lived experience. We're here to have an honest conversation. We don't want to minimize or deny an experience that anyone may have had, regardless of any category we may feel they fit into. We must commit to being respectful and open, and more than anything, to listen. We're all still learning. While our goal is not to get political, we must be aware that we're not having these conversations in a vacuum. There are larger conversations happening on our campus, in our district, across the country, and even globally. As feminist Carol Hennish said in her 1969 paper, "The personal is political." We can't just choose neutrality when it comes to issues such as these. It all starts with truth. As a learning institution, we must tell the truth. So before we begin, we would like to present to you the newly written LACC Land Acknowledgement. This was written by members of the RESJ Committee in consultation with Native leaders. We present it to you as a reading by our student Sal Yazzie Cruz, featuring music by Tongva, Chumash, and Yaome culture bearer Tina Calderon, together with images of Los Angeles and our campus.
We acknowledge that this beautiful land on which Los Angeles sits was originally and is still inhabited and cared for by the Gabrielino Tongva and Gabrielino Kizh peoples, and that their relationship to the land is unceded. We reflect on the sovereignty of the land, the plants and non-human relatives across millennia, the literal undergrowth and underground, before and beyond this learning institution was built atop it. We recognize that successive waves of settler colonialism of the Spanish, Californios, Mexicans, and then Americans together brought centuries of displacement, enslavement, incarceration, and genocide. The United States government defrauded many tribes from this land. Many treaties made in California were never ratified, and those that were ratified were not upheld. We address the privilege of living on lands that were taken in the name of manifest destiny through profound violence and injustice. We commit to educating and advocating with the hope of undoing indigenous erasure and transforming this institution. We wish to chart a path forward for redressing the harm inflicted by the land dispossession through meaningful, resource-centered partnerships and true collaborative relationships with tribal nations. We pledge to respect and enhance indigenous sovereignty and self-determination, to build and maintain equitable and inclusive learning environments, and to foster decolonizing opportunities. We endorse the land back and climate justice movements as we embrace our responsibility to be good land stewards and honor the rights of the land and all original peoples of Turtle Island. We ground this work in truth and hope it inspires others to take action.
For the first segment of our show, we are fortunate to have LACC President Mary Gallagher, under whose leadership the RESJ committee was formed and multiple initiatives put in place, together with a very special guest, Mark Charles. Mark comes to us from Piscataway lands in what is now called Washington, D.C. Mark is a public speaker, writer, and consultant who teaches on the complexities of American history, race, culture, and religion. He's the co-author of the book Unsettling Truths. Mark was the keynote speaker last November for our Day of Gratitude here at LACC. He gave a dynamic talk on the founding of America, the doctrine of discovery, which has since been officially denounced by the Vatican. He also spoke on threats of white Christian nationalism, the history of Thanksgiving, Abraham Lincoln, and even the NFL. There were some strong reactions to Mark's presentation, and we are excited and honored to have him back to Los Angeles City College for a follow-up visit. For years, Mark has been calling for a formal and national dialogue on issues of race, gender, and class. In that spirit, we welcome Mark Charles with LACC President Mary Gallagher. Thank you, Mary and Mark. Before they are joined,
Hi, Mark. It's great to see you again. Thank you so much for coming back to LACC.
Thank you, Mary. It's wonderful to be here. I really enjoy being back in Southern California. I went to school in this area, and it's an honor to be back on campus with you.
Well, I want to start asking the questions and having the conversation this afternoon with you around the Day of Gratitude. You joined us last year for the Day of Gratitude, and after your talk, which was very compelling for so many people who were there. There were some people with very strong reactions on both sides of the aisle, if you will, to the talk you gave that day. And I wanted to ask you what your experience has been in giving the talks that you've given, and what happens with people who have very, very strong feelings, mostly con to what you are, the message you're bringing.
Yes. So have been talking about these topics for almost 15 years now. I started when I was living on the Navajo Nation with my family. We were living on the reservation, and I began learning about and speaking about and writing about the doctrine of discovery. Since then, we've moved to D.C., and I've spoken not only around the country, but even around the world about some of these topics. And there is, especially early on, there was a lot of very sharp reactions to what I was saying. And that is because largely the history I've been talking about is a history we don't teach in our country. One of the things we point out in the book I wrote on Unsettling Truths is that the victors write the history. And the United States of America has never lost a war that matters. We've never been invaded, we've never been disarmed, we've never given up large tracts of land. So by and large, we've written our own history for the past 250 years, which means we've minimized our own oppression and injustices, and we've raised up the good things that we've done. And over time, that creates mythology. And so much of the history that I talk about is a history that's there, it's written, but it's almost never covered. And early on in my presentations, I saw frequently that there was a very sharp reaction, primarily from white Christian men involved in either military or police service. And in my presentations, you know, I talk about our nation's history, I talk about what we've done, I talk about how the foundings of our country, the Declaration of Independence, calls Native savages, the Constitution never mentions women, counts Africans as 3/5 of a person, constitutionally protects slavery under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system in our 13th Amendment, right? We have all these things that are in there, and most people don't even know they're there. And that has profound impact on how things get played out in our courts and on our streets. And so there is a reaction when I talk about these things, and primarily it's white, Christian, male, law enforcement, or military veterans, because these are people who have signed up to protect our nation, to protect their communities. They've signed up and agreed that in certain circumstances they have a right to take a life. and they've assumed that they're fighting on the side of good and of God even. And so they've never morally thought through the implications of the actions that they may be asked to take. And in my presentations, I demonstrate how our nation was founded on white supremacy and inequality, on oppression, on genocide, on ethnic cleansing, on enslavement, on all these dehumanizing things. And we've been doing it for the past 250 years. And this creates a moral quandary in people where they don't know what to do. And so there's a very sharp reaction against what I'm saying, because I'm presenting them with a moral dilemma that they've never thought through, and there might even be some truth that they're fighting on the wrong side. They're agreed to do these actions on the wrong side of history, or the wrong side of what's right and what's wrong. And I saw this so frequently and so consistently in my presentations. And I also noticed that it was about 0.5% of my audience was going to be so triggered by what I said that they would actually stand up and call me a liar in the middle of my presentations. And also after my presentations, I would have two lines of people. I would have a line of people of color who were somber, but even also giddy. I didn't know all the details. I didn't know all these facts, but you've demonstrated what I was always told was a conspiracy theory of what actually happened in the history. And then I would have a line of, again, white people who would look at me and say, I had no idea the history was that bad. And as I observed this over and over and over again, I began to recognize what looked like trauma in my white audiences. It wasn't PTSD, it wasn't complex PTSD, it wasn't historical trauma, but I observed a trauma, and I shared that with some of my colleagues in the psych field. And I came across some research by Rachel McNair, who wrote a book called Perpetration-Induced Traumatic Stress. And she called it The Psychology of Killing. And she was studying, if society gives you the right to take a life, what does that do to you psychologically? She looked at a very comprehensive study on Vietnam veterans. She looked at this quote by Socrates that said the doer of injustice is more miserable than the sufferer. And she concluded that this psychology of killing creates what she called a perpetration-induced traumatic stress. It had all the symptoms of a PTSD, but instead of afflicting the victim of the horrifying event, it afflicted the perpetrator. The moment I found her research, I thought, that's what's going on in my white audiences. Because you can't build a nation on 500 years of dehumanizing injustice without traumatizing yourself or your community. And so I began to recognize this trauma in my white audiences, and I began to develop tools to prepare for those audiences as another traumatized group of people, just like I prepare for black audiences and native audiences and other minority audiences, understanding the PTSD, the complex PTSD, and the historical trauma that they've experienced. I began preparing for my white audiences in much the same way. Now, that doesn't mean I minimize all of their reactions, but it does help me filter and understand kind of what's going on when I come across sometimes these very strong reactions. But they do exist, and I see them fairly frequently.
That's so interesting how you have presented that information. It prompts another question that I have, and that has to do with the notion of white privilege. And I call it a notion of white privilege from my, and I'll just very matter-of-factly state and very honestly state that it was my naivete and my ignorance that I didn't understand white privilege. And for people of color listening to a white woman saying, I don't understand white privilege, I do now, but I didn't for many, many years, sounds unbelievable, I think, but it's the truth. And when it hit me, I was in conversation with a small group actually here at the college. I was meeting with a small group of faculty, and as I was talking about white privilege, it hit me. White privilege doesn't have to do with socioeconomic privilege. It has to do with the color of your skin, positioning you in a very, very different situation from anyone who is not your color. So just because I'm white, things happen for me that don't happen for someone who is not white. That recognition started to have a major shift for me. So when I think about the concept of racism and the importance of understanding and really fully engaging with racism, I think about when I really became aware of different races. So my question to you, Mark, is when did you start to become aware?
That's a great question. So I grew up in a very white evangelical neighborhood. I was living on a mission compound. My father's parents, my father's Navajo, my mother's American of Dutch heritage, and my father's parents were working as translators for the missionaries on this mission compound and what was at that time a boarding school. And my mom's family, they were Dutch American living in the Dutch community in both Chicago and in Denver and Iowa, other parts around the country, Grand Rapids. And she came to New Mexico as a nurse, actually on her way to Africa. But she was there to get some training, and while she was there, she met my father, and she never left. And so I grew up in a very white, evangelical, conservative home. I was attending a school that was serving as a boarding school. I was there as a day school student, but other students were there as boarding school students. Our experiences were very different. And that was the environment I grew up in. I then went off to college at UCLA. And was a student here in Southern California for 5 years. And then I moved back to New Mexico and began working within the Native community. And I moved around and eventually got married. And my family and I ultimately moved back. We were in Denver, Colorado. I was pastoring a church in Denver called the Christian Indian Center. And we moved from there to the Navajo Reservation. And we moved into a very remote section of our reservation. We were 6 miles off the nearest paved road on a dirt road. We lived in a one-room hogan about 25 feet in diameter. It had log walls and a dirt floor. Our neighbors were rug weavers and shepherds. There was no running water, no electricity in that community. And we lived how most of my generation either grew up or at least spent their summers, and how a large number of our people live today. Now, we knew we were moving into this environment, and we prepared to live off the grid, to haul our water, to use an outhouse, to herd sheep. Like, we were ready for all this. But what caught us by surprise was how absolutely marginalized we felt. We learned very quickly that the only non-natives we ever saw were those who came to give us charity or those who came to take our picture. Almost no one came for the purpose of actually building a meaningful relationship. And almost no one ever came back. As we were living there and I was experiencing this, I was also learning about the history of our nation much more accurately. I was experiencing the historical trauma of my people, of what was happening there. And I realized I was actually becoming very angry. And I could feel this anger kind of growing up inside of me. And every time I'd sit down to try to process it with some of my non-native friends, who were some of the people I knew best, over the phone or email or letters, because they weren't coming to the reservation, right? I could count on one hand the number of non-natives who came to visit us in the Hogan those first 3 years. And every time we would process it and talk about it, I would begin to discuss these things, and I could feel this anger coming up. And soon I'd have to bite my tongue hang up the phone or put down my pen so I wouldn't start yelling or screaming at my friends. I was feeling so angry. I learned how to temper myself. I'd write about it, talk about it in the third person. That let me engage in it longer and better. But then my friends would get defensive. I didn't do that to your people. It wasn't my family or my people who did those things. And soon they would hang up the phone. And I did not know how to have a conversation about what I was feeling in an honest way that actually invited conversation instead of brought these clashes of either screaming or of silence. And I was writing a letter to my friends. This is like the 10th time trying to start this dialogue. And I said to my friends, I said, being Native American, living on the reservation, in the middle of this country, it feels like our people are this old grandmother who has a very large and a very beautiful house. And years ago, some people came into our house and they violently locked us upstairs in the bedroom. Today, our house is full of people. They're sitting on our furniture, they're eating our food, they're having a party inside our house. They've since come upstairs and they've unlocked the door to our bedroom, but it's much later. We're tired, we're old, we're weak, we're sick, so we can't or we don't come out. But the thing that hurts us the most, what causes us the most pain, is that virtually nobody from this party ever comes upstairs, seeks out the grandmother in the bedroom, sits down next to her on the bed, takes her hand, and just simply says, thank you. Thank you for letting us be in your house. I wrote those words, and immediately I'm like, that's it. That's what I'm feeling. I started sharing that with some members of my community. And some people who lived in that area for most of their lives said, I've always struggled to know how to articulate how it feels, and you're hitting the nail on the head. I would share it with non-natives off the reservation. And instead of getting defensive and saying, we didn't do that, that wasn't my fault, they would come back to me and say, how do we say thank you? How do we come up to this grandmother and thank her for allowing us to be in the house? And this started a very different conversation, not based on anger or, it's something everyone could relate to, and it allowed me as a Native man to express honestly how I felt, and allowed us to talk about the history in a context that was actually much more productive. And I've used that metaphor literally around the globe to try and initiate dialogue between indigenous peoples and their colonizers. And it's probably one of the most effective tools I've found to start that dialogue.
That's really great. As you were talking, I was thinking myself about my experiences and how I got to the place in late May, early June of 2020 to really stand up and do something definitive about racism. And in my world, which was LA City College, to really do something and not talk about it. Talking about it, having a conversation about it is a good start, but you have to be willing to stand up and do something and really come to terms with what is our reality and try to redefine how we interact and how we understand each other.
And that, I think, gets to the heart of some of the challenges, because I start with a conversation. The goal is to move towards action. The challenge is, as I've been doing this for 20 years now, is that Western America, our Western culture, American culture, is hyper-individualistic. And it doesn't know how to act or understand things in a systemic or corporate way. And so most people will come up to me, even after presentations or talks, and they'll want to apologize to me. I'm sorry, and I'm sorry this happened. I'm sorry what took place. Please forgive me. And I have to explain, I'm not mad at you. right? Again, just like you were saying, it's the color of your skin and the way society treats you because of the color of your skin. It's not even necessarily something you as an individual are doing, but it's because of all these things society has set up, so people with your color skin get treated in this way. And so people would love to address things at an individual level because that's much less expensive, rather than change the system, which is going to create chaos, right? It's going to reshape everything that we're standing on. And so what I'm finding is I have to actually try to prevent people from responding individually, because the change, if we're going to have lasting change in this country, we need to address the issue systemically. And most people are excited about making individual change, but they don't want to change the system. They don't want to change what's been made systemic. And so, for example, we started this conversation off with about white privilege. One of the things I've learned to do in my presentations, in my lectures, even my book, is there's certain words I don't use. I don't use the word racial reconciliation. It's a misnomer, right? If you understand race, race is not a genetic difference, it's a human construct. And in America, race was constructed for the express purpose of oppressing and dividing. So the notion of racial reconciliation is a misnomer. Reconciliation implies there was a previous harmony. No, race was constructed to divide. So I use the term racial conciliation, because conciliation is merely mediating a dispute. So we're trying to make this right for the first time. The same thing with white privilege. I don't use the word white privilege in my talks or in my book. White privilege makes it sound like white people have been blessed in a way that they have to learn how to share. And what I try to communicate is, no, the reason you're treated differently is not because you're blessed, not because you've been given a privilege. It's the fruit of a history of white supremacy and racism. It's the fruit of injustice. It doesn't need to be shared. It needs to be confronted. And so I don't use the term white privilege. I use the term white supremacy and say we have to learn how to confront these things to make the changes that are necessary. And I found, just by using these terms, entering into the conversation, saying racial conciliation instead of reconciliation, saying white supremacy instead of white privilege, what it does is it brings people in at a much more somber and deeper level of understanding, yeah, there's some things we really need to discuss here that are not out in the open.
And it really brings you to the point of some type of reaction. Language is powerful.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. And not to excuse something, but to really hit a point hard.
Yeah.
You kind of touched on this, but let me ask you, there's been a lot of talk about critical race theory. And I'm curious as to how you look at what the different comments are relative to critical race theory. I mean, you just about touched on it, and so I thought I'd dig into that a little deeper.
So, and we don't have time in this conversation to go in depth into the trauma of white America, but it's in my book. I've given lectures on it. If people just Google it online, they'll be able to find it. But understanding the trauma of white America, and one of the first symptoms of trauma is shock and denial. And so when you understand white America as another group of traumatized people, the reaction that is given to critical race theory makes perfect sense. Critical race theory is a fairly broad area. A lot of people don't even know what critical race theory is, but there's a few key components. First of all, it is the history as told from the margins, right? So if the victors write the history, critical race theory is the history told from the people who weren't the victors, the people on the margins. Second, critical race theory assumes that the injustices are not individual but systemic. And so right away that kind of counters a lot of what I will call this house of cards that white America has set up to explain and understand their own history. Yes, we had injustices, but they were due to individuals who did bad things, right? The victors write the history. We've never lost a war. Look how great our history is. Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, which is not true, right? Abraham Lincoln loved and created equality in our country, which is not true, right? He was one of the most genocidal presidents in our nation's history. His policies towards Native Americans were atrocious. And yet, because the victors write the history, that's what we teach, that's what people learn. When you hear the history from the margins, that house of cards begins to fall down. And so if you have an intentional ignorance built on this mythology, and you start hearing a history that's coming from the margins and that's assuming the injustices are not the result of an individual, but a system that's been established, that's terrifying. Absolutely terrifying. Terrifying enough to ban books and to scream at people and to silence things and to take out DEI departments and to run entire campaigns to say, we have to shut this down. Otherwise, it's going to expose what we don't want to see exposed. And so when you understand both the history and the trauma of white America, the reaction we get to critical race theory is not surprising at all. And at times, you either have to laugh or cry when you see it, one of the two. But yeah. So yeah, I've tried to engage in some of that dialogue. The interesting thing about our book, right, there's a lot of books that are kind of in the midst of all this critical race theory dialogue. Our book has been out of that circle. And it's not because we don't tell the history from the margins or assume the injustice is systemic. We actually do both of those things very loudly. But we don't use the trigger words that get people to react to it in that way. And so our book has, while our book doesn't say critical race theory, it actually is. And it's just, but we've been out that side of the conversation because we were intentional not to trigger the people so they're screaming at our books. Now they're just not reading it, which is, you know, I mean, our book's doing well, but it's not a national bestseller. Yeah, so we're working very hard to say, how do we get people to talk about this and not scream about it? And a lot of these books out there that get people screaming, they may get national press, but they're not very good at engaging a national dialogue. Screaming is not conversation.
That's true. So in thinking about how to approach this and how to go about this and how to really have meaningful dialogue, what are the key things that you really are proponing for an institution like LA City College, who really does want to have the tough conversations and really grapple with some of these challenges that we face, not just as an institution, but in our greater society that we live in every day?
Yeah. I will say I've been very impressed with my limited exposure to what's going on at LACC. But in the 2 times I've been here, you have, first of all, you've brought me in, which is a lot of institutions don't want to bring me in because of some of the things I say. But even when I learned about what you're doing with the Day of Gratitude and kind of the history you're trying to address there, your starting of this series of the Candid Conversations and the dialogues you're trying to engage, all of those things I absolutely affirm. I love to see that kind of thing taking place. And, you know, one of the things that I'm working very hard to, and I said before, I'm working towards change, but I'm working towards systemic change, not individual change. And most of America would rather have individual change. And so, you know, one of the ways I phrase it, in America, our values is we have a higher value for being unbelievably wealthy or rich at any cost and giving charitably than living justly and just having less. Right? That's our value system as a country. We would rather be as wealthy as possible, regardless of how we got there, and give charitably than live justly and just have less. And so the goal I'm working towards is systemic change. But to motivate people to do the hard work to gain to do systemic change, there is a lot of education that has to happen. Again, most people don't know their history. They don't know what they're standing on. There's both an intentional ignorance and a mythology that's been created. And so I use this quote all the time. There's a quote by Georges Erasmus, who is a Dene leader from what's now called Canada. And when he was writing about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission there, he used a quote in one of his letters. And the quote he used says, "Where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community." If you want to build community, you have to start by creating common memory. And that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to teach the history. I'm trying to create this common memory. I'm trying to give people a baseline understanding of who we are as a country so that we can actually have the conversations. I can't have a conversation with 90% of the people in our country because they don't know our history. And so any way that LACC, whether it's through your Day of Gratitude, through your Candid Conversations, or through the classes that you teach in your classrooms, the lectures that your professors give, anything they can do, you can do to create this common memory, to teach our nation's actual history, is going to have tremendous value when it gets to the time and point where we have to say as a nation, do we want to change? Not just individually, not just giving charitably. Do we want to be more just as a society and just have less than what we're used to having? And that's the kind of change. And so any way that LACC is doing that currently and can continue doing that, I'm all for it. I love to see what's happening there.
I really like the history from the margins. I see that as something that could be incredibly valuable to us, and really add to the dialogue. Something like this, where we're intentionally getting together to have a conversation and to bring others into the conversation. And the vision is that we have a large group of people sitting around having conversations about a variety of things, but that really force us to deal with some of our really difficult challenges that we have in working together on any number of things that we have to work on. I think your whole orientation, well, it's not your orientation, but your thought about the individualism of the American person coming to this country to make it on their own and make it themselves, and it's not community oriented, and it shows in the fabric of our lack of community awareness these days. And it isn't just happening in large cities like Los Angeles. It's happening in small rural communities as well. The notion that as an individual you can be stronger, that's just never been an orientation. I'm from a large family. I'm one of 12. And so I don't know what it's like to not share and not be involved with others to do things. But and there's a certain level of comfort, so it makes you wonder what's the level of uncomfort to that person who is such an individual. That is money enough to make you comfortable? Probably not. It always sounds good to those of us who don't have it, but the reality of it is, and then when is enough enough?
Yeah.
And to kind of to orient us back around to this whole notion of what we're really working on here is really the area of social justice and anti-racism, and bringing awareness to people who may or may not be aware, but putting it front and center and forcing the conversation. The first time I saw one of your talks, I saw a TED Talk, I had reactions. I had just like, and wow. And for me, I'm fortunate that I didn't have the reaction of, I want to turn this off. But it was unbelievable because it wasn't my orientation.
Yeah.
So I would say we have a long way to go because, I mean, I am a advanced age person, you know, been on this earth over 6 decades. But I think that the feelings that I have and the experiences that I have really informed what I do. And I'm not even informed enough. I haven't had history. I haven't learned history at the margins.
Yeah.
And it's important for us to learn that. I mean, I like that whole concept of even thinking along doing a series of that so that we can start the education of this, because there's a lot to be educated on.
Absolutely. I could not agree more. And then the challenge in that is how do we gather people to discuss these types of things and to have these kind of conversations? You know, I travel around the country, I lecture, and I give presentations, and I do Q&As. And after every lecture, because every lecture is the same in that it gives people a history they've never heard before. And so I could almost tell you what questions they're going to ask me because I've done this so many times, right? Of they're going to respond out of this based on trauma or based on their experience, and these are the questions that are going to come up. And with our book, I've done something different. And on my website, with my book, I do what I call my book study special, where I sell copies of my book on my website, and if people buy 10 copies of my book from my website, I will give them a 45-minute virtual Q&A for their book study. Mm. And what this does, so I've sold dozens of these, and what it does is now, once a week, almost, I'm having a 45-minute virtual Q&A with people who have read the book, wrestled with it within their study, and are now ready to discuss it with me as the author. And it's a very different Q&A than I have after a presentation, because what the questions that come up after a presentation are almost entirely based on trauma. And once you get a few REM cycles in you and your brain starts sifting through a few things and you calm down, your adrenaline stops flowing, you have a whole nother set of questions. And then once you've been exposed to something and you've seen it and you can't stop seeing it, then you have a whole nother set of questions. And so I'm constantly looking like, okay, I know how to have the trauma-informed question Q&As. I even know how to have the day after Q&As after they have a few REM cycles in them. I'm looking for the later conversations because those are the conversations where people are actually able to begin discussing maybe some change. And so I'm constantly looking at how do I get to that point where I'm not just doing these initial Q&As, but having the much later conversations. And the tool of writing the book and then using some of these resources to create these environments where we can have these follow-up conversations. Coming back, I was at LACC several months ago, coming back this time and having this conversation, these are the things I live for. I love these types of dialogues. So the more that people take up this strategy and do these types of things, this is the dream for me.
This is the dream for me too, to be able to have this open conversation and this experience where you actually are uncomfortable with some of what is said, because it's not your orientation. It's not what you. I mean, I was thinking earlier as you were talking, it's not the indoctrination that I got and that I believed in, because that's what I was told and it was reinforced. So the relearning, I think, is really important for us, and relearning as an adult has tremendous value. So it's being open to learn something new and different, and not to close your mind to it and say, ooh, that can't be right. That's not what I learned. What is he talking about?
Yeah.
Lincoln was a great president. He has a holiday.
Yeah.
But I think the other thing is to understand that symbols and days of observance and things like that are important to how we practice our values. And so in one of the things that has happened here at City College is some of the artifacts that we have on our campus. In our symbol of our college, our college stamp, is something that is incredibly offensive to the Native community, because it's an El Camino bell, and it just is rife for Native Americans with just horrible situations that took place all up and down the state of California.
Yeah.
In the name of I don't even know what. How can you even describe it when you think about exactly what happened? And we actually have a bell that is implanted by one of our buildings that will be removing. Part of the work of the Race, Equity, and Social Justice Committee is to start to figure out, what do we do with this?
Yeah.
And how do we reshape how we do it? And there's preservation for historical purposes to understand the removal of the bell, why the bell was removed, but to preserve the bell so that you preserve the history of why was that bell removed.
Yeah.
Why was it first put in permanently by a building, and why was it removed? Our seal has the Camino Real bell, so we will be changing our college seal. That's a huge step to take for a college to say, this is no longer acceptable as a representation of who we are.
Yeah.
So we're grappling with that. Names of buildings.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. I mean, when you name something after someone, you have to be very aware of the history of that individual.
Yeah.
And so really grappling with that and getting our arms around that, I think that's the beginnings of us really beginning to understand how what we say and do, and even the symbols that we have around our institution, have an impact on people. And how do we make sure that we listen to each other and respond to each other so that we live in community, not in individualism?
Yeah.
Because the fact of the matter is, to survive, we need each other.
Yeah.
And the more we are together, the stronger we are as a community. And that's the beauty of it.
Yeah. I completely agree with what you said regarding there's a difference between what we celebrate and what we remember. You know, Columbus Day. I don't want to celebrate Columbus Day. I also don't want to forget it, right? I don't want to forget that history happened, and I want to make sure we never do anything like that again. Now, as we're talking about exploring space and colonizing the moon, and you know, like we're just going on. If we forget Columbus Day and all the injustice and horrors of colonization, we're going to we are doing it again. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I think there's a big difference between, okay, what do we just stop celebrating, but make sure we continue to remember? Because if we just forget things, then we're just going to keep making the same mistakes over and over and over again.
That's right. We didn't learn anything.
Yes.
So I think that that concludes this this first session of our Candid Convos. I really appreciate the opportunity to have talked with you. We spent almost the last hour together having this conversation, and what I look forward to is having the opportunity now for our Race Equity Social Justice Committee to get together and talk about this Candid Convo and what we will do in the future of these. So thank you for being our inaugural guest on this on these conversations. It was great to see you again, Mark.
Thank you, Mary. It's an honor to be here, and I hope this is the start of something very big and very meaningful.
I look forward to that.
Thank you, Mary and Mark. Before they are joined by a small group of students and faculty, I would like to address something that we've all heard of by now, and that's what's known as cancel culture. When we began talking in the RESJ committee about having this series of open and candid conversations, some expressed concerns over cancel culture. So what is it? It's a phrase by which those who are deemed to have acted or spoken in an unacceptable manner are ostracized, boycotted, or shunned. This may extend to social or professional circles, social media, or in person. Where do we draw the line between actions and words that should be called out and censorship or limiting free speech? Let me describe an example. As a learning institution, we are committed to respecting all points of view, but our responsibility is also to the truth. So if someone says that Donald Trump won the 2020 election, we must respect that person's right to have that opinion and not cancel them. But we must also push back and do whatever we can to help them see the truth. Anti-racist work must be grounded in truth. So with this Candid Convo and others to come, we don't want to censor or limit free speech, and we certainly don't want the chilling effect brought on by fears of cancel culture. These are free and open conversations. We should feel free to share whatever viewpoints we have, but we must be open-minded. It's been said that those who don't know the truth are easily led to believe lies. With that, let's welcome our full panel for a more in-depth discussion. Welcome back, everybody. We are joined by a couple of additional guests we're very excited to have who are part of our LACC community. I'd like to introduce each of them and then maybe give them a chance to tell us a little about themselves. Jessica McCready is a really brilliant student here in our cinema and television department. She's an artist, a musician. She just starred in our film, our big department collaboration film, so it's called One Last Epic Heist. Stay tuned for it. Jessica, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And we also have Quentin Leonard, who is a graduate student intern with our department. He's on the professor pathway. Thank you so much for joining us, Quentin.
Thanks for having me.
One of the things I thought was great about your conversation was your first question, like when did we become aware? And maybe you can each elaborate a little bit on when did you become aware of race or something along those lines.
I can go first.
Okay.
I mean, I think with different cultures and ethnicities, it happens at different times. For me, it was very interesting because I think I was in kindergarten and I got called the N-word. And when I got called that I was originally from Michigan, and around kindergarten, actually first grade, we moved to the South for my mom, which ironically, as I became an adult, I learned that they were literally a part of the Great Migration and the Civil Rights Movement. So my parents were from Montgomery, Alabama, probably when they were 18 years old. Yeah, around 18 in the late 1960s, they moved to Michigan to work for the car companies. And those car companies is where they stayed at and retired. So right around the late 80s, one of the, my mom worked for General Motors and Saturn happened and we moved to the South. And I remember being in first grade actually, and it was Halloween, and I remember I wanted to be a clown. And one of the Caucasian kids said to me that I could not be because and that was the first time I've ever heard the word. Like, I never heard it in the North, and I went home and told my mom, and of course, she like, well, she's a mom, so you know what happened. The next day, she was at that school ready to wreak havoc. So, but I think at that point was the initial point I realized race, and I realized that there was a difference, and from there, it just grew. And it grows as you know, periods of your life, it grows in different ways.
I'm from West Palm Beach, Florida. And so just to give a little context on where I'm from, Trump used to live like right around the corner from me. Well, still does, Villa, you know. So it's that type of Florida. It's like Trump's Florida. And those are, so that's where I learned racism from at a young age. I would say probably like 8 or 9. I think I learned racism in 2 different ways too. I learned it really in your face, like M-words, the stereotypical races. That's what real country accent I've had. I've had my fair share of that. But then I would have to say getting out of Florida and starting to work I had an internship at JP Morgan for finance. And that's when I seen the passive aggressive side of it. Because I think it's two different sides to it. So I experienced it heavy in your face. But you know, we grew up with those races. So we fought them, like we put them up. But when you get into this other instance and you have to deal with this different type of racism. So I would say I had a good idea of both types by the time I was like 21. I had a solid understanding that it was going to come from here and there and how it looked. So,
wow. Great, and yeah, this is a free conversation, so Mary, Mark, if you have questions, I'm actually monitoring the chat on my phone as well, and I have a couple questions here that have been submitted. But one other thing, okay, so we talked about your upbringings a little bit. What about today, present day? Like, what's hard about today?
Today, it would be, I relocated to California about 5 years ago, and it was a bit of a culture shock. Where I'm from, I'm pretty much around like Haitians, Jamaicans, and that's really my vibe. So coming to California and being around all of these different ethnicities and these different races and these different cultures, I think the passive aggressive and what I was talking about, moving here, it had like a mental toll on me because it was just like, okay, not only do I not have kind of a lot of people who look like me or have this stance, because it's a very specific stance that I have from back home. A lot of people can't see what's going on. So people think I'm crazy. And I'd be like, no. It's a completely different experience. So I would say, I think the hardest thing is being around, I went from just being around like white people who didn't really care for black people to all the ethnicities. And there's like, Black Americans are almost everybody's least favorite. So I get it from, and this is just an open conversation. So not only do I get it from white, but I get it from Koreans. I get it from Indians. I get it from Arabic people. I get that. I'm black and just Black American too, because kind of we have black and we have blacks from Nigeria, different. That's a different. They get treated differently. There's a culture that's associated with that. But my experience is that of a Black American, and being here and it coming from so many different spaces has been like it's like, okay, interesting.
Wow. That's a lot. Yeah. Quentin.
I mean, just to piggyback off of what she said, I mean, she had mentioned earlier about having a corporate job, and the one word that I remember, and just to give a little history, I was at a company, and me and 5 other employees ended up being in a lawsuit for racial discrimination, and that was in LA, and so it was later on in my career, but through that process, we had to go get, see a counselor, see a psychiatrist. And the one thing I realized was this key word called gaslighting. And once the counselor or the psychiatrist explained it, I was like, oh my God, I've been gaslighted ever since I started working. Like, it just was like a bulb that went off. It was like, ever since the first job I ever had at 16, every single job, even to current day at some of the other places I work at, there's always been like that little inkling of gaslighting. The cool thing about it is, though, once you know it's happening, you know it's happening. So, and I think that in similarities, I was kind of like you coming from the South, but I moved around and bounced around to the Midwest and the South and came to California. And, you know, every different person of color have their own struggles and their own experiences. And I feel like sometimes, even within the community of blacks or any other race, that you try to do a hierarchy on accident. It happens. Sometimes it's by the tone of your skin color, and it goes from there. But yeah, you do receive different type of racism based on sometimes color of your skin, sometimes just because you are perceived one way and you're not that way. I think that in certain cultures, especially if I was to specifically say my culture and how I was raised from my parents coming from the South, we were taught certain etiquettes growing up so that way we wouldn't fall into certain categories because we needed to be safe. And if you look at today's society, it hasn't changed, it's just a different undertone to it. It's not so blatantly in your face, but it's still there. If you look at what's going on in the world today, you still have issues with people getting attacked on the street. You have issues with shootings right now and stuff. Like, Florida is so bad right now with shootings. There was just one this weekend in Florida at, I can't remember what city it was. I don't know. It was recently, and it was because of the gun control. They start shooting out on Memorial Day, and there was a couple people who got hit, and at the end of the day, it was just like, oh, well, just another Sunday in Florida, you know? So it's horrible, but.
Wow.
I think one of the things I try to bring into these conversations about, especially about as our nation's history regarding race. For most of our nation's history, the racial dialogue has largely been black versus white. That's largely because of the way race was constructed, right? So the black race was constructed through what's called the one-drop rule, partially, where if you have a single drop of African blood, you're black, which allowed them to grow the population. You were the labor force. And so a white slave owner could rape his female slave and produce more babies to enslave, right? That's how that race grew. Natives were grown through what's called the blood quantum rule, where you could be full and then half and then a quarter and eighth and then you're bred out of existence. Why? Because they had treaties with us and they wanted our land. So they wanted to diminish our numbers. And both of our groups, whether it's the African American or the Native, we disrupt one of the primary mythologies of this nation's history, which is that it's a nation of immigrants. And black and Native destroy that myth because you didn't immigrate to be here, right? Your ancestors were kidnapped, they were brought here and enslaved, and my people are indigenous to these lands, and so everyone else, regardless of skin color, can keep that narrative. Even President Obama and Kamala Harris can keep that narrative alive because their histories are they immigrated here. But the narrative of we're a nation of immigrants gets disrupted when you enter the scene or when I enter the scene, and that's where I think we see a lot of the pushback. The dialogue around black versus white has been center stage because the black population was grown and increased, and the Native conversation has been always pushed to the margins and minimized because they want none of us here because then they can have our land and not keep their treaties.
Ironically, it's funny that you say that because some of the things I was looking up before we all met was the fact that there was two things. One is that a lot of African Americans are mixed with Native American. But if you take a 23andMe test, it doesn't show up. It doesn't. It's switched. It's not there. And there's been a lot of topics about that and on social media about how they know. Like, even for me, I took it with me and my family, and it didn't show up. But I knew specifically that my great-grandmother was Cherokee Indian, and I saw her before she passed. And so I was confused. I was like, why is it not showing up? But then I realized that it is a thing where Native Americans are being brushed out. And when they ask about, you know, and you can Google it, and there's questions about why is it not showing up, and their excuse or their reasoning behind it is because they don't have a good history of what each one is and so forth. So therefore, it's not popping up or it's not populating. What is your take on that? As your eyebrows went down.
So I would say my opinion of, well, let me put it this way, rather than say my opinion. This obsession our nation has, right, with DNA testing and who am I? On one hand, it makes perfect sense, right? Because most of the undocumented immigrants who live here, who are white people, don't have a treaty, don't have anything justifying them being here. They can't go back to Europe, right? They can't leave. If they go back to the Netherlands or to Germany or France, like, they'll be like, who are you? You're an American. You can't, like, they left their home. Most African Americans were kidnapped, literally kidnapped, and brought here, and and then the records were lost and mixed, and so there's this deep desire to know, because if you say my identity began when I got off the boat, whether it was a slave ship or an ocean liner, right? That still, it doesn't answer the question. So one of the things that my people have that is very unique is we have something that white America can't buy, can't steal, can't take from us, which is a connection to this land. We have stories, a creation story that put us here, and histories, oral histories that go back hundreds, even thousands of years. And that's something I think every human has an innate desire to understand and have. And so the DNA testing for almost everyone else in America is like, yeah, I want to understand that because I don't know where I'm from. As a native, I'm like, I don't need a DNA test. I got my oral history. I can go back to the Reds. I can sit with my elders. I can hear these stories. I can connect with this culture. I can see our four sacred mountains. And that's enough to connect me to the land.
I'm sorry.
No, so, yeah, so that's where I'm like, so as I watch, it doesn't surprise me that the nation has this obsession with DNA testing because it largely doesn't know who it is. But as a Native man, and that's one thing where I'm like, yeah, I'm very, very grateful that I lived on our reservation. I heard the stories from my elders. I understood and saw these things, and that deeply, deeply roots me here.
I'm curious, too, because I do wonder, I mean, like, for you, you have that deep root, but you're also mixed. So do you ever look at the other side? Because I know you mentioned that you're part Dutch. So with that being said, like, have you looked on that side of your family? And I know being mixed can be kind of like a, you know, my mixed friends, they battle back and forth with how they identify.
This is a big issue both within the general population and within Indian country, within Native America, which is blood quantum. Right? That's often how tribal affiliation is. The Cherokee don't use blood quantum. You just have to have documented proof that you were a descendant of someone on the original rolls. But a lot of other tribes use blood quantum to base tribal citizenship on. And so one of the things that I started doing very intentionally with my own identity, my mother's American and Dutch heritage, my father's Navajo. Right? In the Navajo culture, when you introduce yourself, you give your 4 clans. We're matrilineal. My identity comes from my mother's mother. My mother's mother is American of Dutch heritage. America, Western Europe, United States is patriarchal. So to white people, I'm Navajo, because that's who my father is. And to my Navajo people, I'm Dutch, because that's who my mother is. And so what I've had to do intentionally, this is why one of the reasons we moved back to the reservation. I was raised in a border town. I was raised, you know, in a white evangelical setting. I went to school in Southern California. I didn't know my language growing up. I didn't know my culture growing up. And so when I wanted to understand that better, I intentionally moved back to the reservation, lived in that very remote setting, raised our children there, sent them to an immersion school, gave them those stories and understanding. And one of the things I'm adamant about is I'm not half. I'm not half Dutch and half Navajo. I am Dutch and I am Navajo. And I've gone through incredible lengths to gain integrity within both communities, of both being accepted and having identity there. And so this is, one of the things in any country that will get an eye roll more quickly than not is people who will say, well, I have this ancestor who's Native or that ancestor who's Native. And a lot of what we're looking for is, do you know the community? Right? It's not about, I used to have this relative, but do you know your people? Do you know your community? Are you accepted there? But again, this goes back to how the different races were constructed. So the black race, which was constructed with the one-drop rule, has a whole different set of rules of how you identify and what mixed means and everything else than it does. In a lot of ways, I think the Native communities can sometimes shoot ourselves in the foot when we buy into this blood quantum and use that within our tribal communities to establish enrollment or identity, because that is literally eventually going to wipe us out. And so, yeah, these are things that, so I identify, I am Navajo and I am Dutch. I am just as much the son of my father as I am the son of my mother. I'm not half, I'm both.
That's a good response.
I like that.
That's great. We have a comment from the chat, Angela Miller, and I think she was responding to what you were saying, Jessica. She says, we also get it from Africans from various countries, too.
Oh, nobody likes us.
Oh, yeah.
Nobody likes us. It's a given.
She says, skin color doesn't always equate with kinship. And I have a follow-up question on that, and it comes from what you said, Mark, which really hit me when you said you don't use the word white privilege, because I've also been very aware of white privilege. But you said you use the word white supremacy, and I'm like, wow, that hits hard. So my question is, receiving racism from all these different groups, is there something different, or what's different about the racism from white people or white supremacy?
Systemic. I think when it comes to other nationalities and having this distrust or dislike for us, I think that trend was started by white people. I think they're following suit with something that has been developed and cultivated since for a while. So, but when it comes to white people specifically, I would say it's systemic. So I feel what happens when it's like, yes, this one person is being racist to me, I get it, but also whoever created all of these rules that I live under, they're also white. And so it just hits a different point then, because you just understand that they have a handle on things that is way bigger than just like this one lady being mean. So I think that would be the thing that gets me.
Did you want to go?
Oh, go ahead. Well, yeah, go ahead.
One of the things I always like to clarify in conversations about white supremacy and racism, oftentimes our country does not know how to have dialogue on race in an accurate or truthful way. And so the notion is, the understanding is that we have a lot of people who are racist, and we have a few people who are white supremacists. That's the general accepted belief we have. So racism is treating someone negatively because of the color of their skin. White supremacy is believing white people are just better. And so I believe that the majority of Americans are white supremacists. Even people of color buy into that narrative, right? Of we aspire to what? To whiteness. That's the place that we want to be. We aspire to that. And so I would say the majority of America is white supremacists, and there's a smaller amount of people who are actually racist. So once a quarter on my Twitter, I tweet out, white people are not superior. I've been called racist for saying that. Right? Think about the context of a nation where you say white people are not superior and you get called racist for saying that. I mean, just pointing out the truth of you are no better nor necessarily worse than me based on the color of your skin. You are, so the way I phrase it is, whiteness is up here, and most people of color are down here. Now, we think this is the enviable position. This is where we need to be. So a good white person will come down here, drop off some charity, and come back. A really good white person will come down here and lift this group up and then go back, right? Again, the enviable position is up here. The problem is living up here requires the oppression of people down here. Life up here is not sustainable. It's based on colonization. It's based on oppression. And so if we're ever going to have an eye-to-eye, peer-to-peer dialogue on race, yes, we have to lift up people of color to the point where we're human. We also have to lower white people from their belief that they're superhuman. And we have to have it in this plane where all of us can see eye to eye as just human beings. And again, it's decentering whiteness is not racist. Now, if you're used to being treated as special, you're just going to feel like you're being treated.
You're angry.
You know? But I'm like, no, that's not. We're just not treating you special. You get the same treatment as the rest of us. The world could not survive if everyone was treated like white people. Whiteness is not sustainable. And so if we're going to have that conversation and live sustainably, we have to lift up the people who are below but we also have to lower the people who think they're at the top.
I mean, I feel that was a great way to explain it. I think that, like you said, with different cultures, sometimes we feel it differently. So even what you say in it still comes off differently for us. Like, everything you're saying is totally valid, is correct, but the way that it happens sometimes is that, I don't know, like there's just so much more mixed in with it sometimes. You know, when you do have someone of color who do want to be that white or European, and so they're acting the same way as if they were white, and they're putting you in a situation. Or if you do have a white person, and it's almost like you're going back to elementary school, where that white person is a popular kid, and if they say something mean to you or they don't like you, the rest of everyone other color comes in and they feel the same way about you. Just because they want to make sure that they agree with this higher up that you're talking about. So that way no one comes and looks for them. The only problem is that I feel like sometimes when you are black and you are at the bottom, that you're targeted more towards versus the person who is Hispanic, Asian. Like, they hit you harder. And I understand that, like, in the culture we live in, and right now I work in a high school, that the things that we put out as black Americans, like hip-hop, art, music, it's like a lot of people like to pull different things from our culture and put it to theirs. But at the same time, they are being more racist when they're using the N-word, you know, versus because they hear us say it, and they're like, oh, I can say it too because you my friend. No. Like, I don't even use it, you know, but they see other people of color using it, and they think that it's okay.
Well, I use it, and ain't nobody in the room using it but me.
And that's the problem is like you have these other cultures hearing it on rap music, and then they think it's okay. And then when you have that conversation, they're like, well, you know, why can you say it and I can't say it? Which then you have to go through a whole ordeal if they're younger explaining it, because unfortunately, like you said, when it comes to critical race theory, it's not being explained in schools. So therefore, that leads them to not know the history of these things that happen because they, quote unquote, are being blindsided by not knowing it, you know? So, and it's weird because if you were raised in a certain era, it was shown more about all these different ethnicities in school. And slowly but surely it has been erased. It's been slowly moved out. And only till recently during the pandemic and Black Lives Matter movement, of all these things like the bell and things like that have been put, a light has been put on that stuff.
How performative do you think that is, though? Because I think a lot of this outrage and a lot of this is performative. It looks cool now, to like black out and Black Lives Matter, especially when people
I mean,
were
you're
writing.
always going to have that. Like,
Yeah.
you're always going to have those, or I want to be a part of it groups, versus being real, like you said, really like lifting up that level. Yeah. You're always going to have those people because those people need to be relevant.
The way I weed that out, if you will, is, again, there's a lot of people who are like, okay, we want to help the natives, we want to be involved in your movement or whatever. And if you've heard me speak and if you listen to my TEDx talk on We the People, I boil it down to land titles, where as recently as 2005, the U.S. Supreme Court used the doctrine of discovery as the legal basis for land titles. And so I tell people, this is the systemic change I want, right? I don't want you to apologize necessarily. I'm not looking for you even to do whatever. I want to have a dialogue on land titles. Mm-hmm. Nobody wants to have that dialogue, right? And I'm going to help. One of the things I was trying to understand is I felt like there are a lot of ways where there's an affinity of like we're moving towards the same thing between the black and the native race, right? We're the two races that were constructed initially. We're called out specifically in the Constitution of not being included, and the history of enslavement and the history of genocide is like that's the founding of this country. Mm-hmm. The challenge is when, I'm not going to say slavery was abolished, when slavery was redefined and codified under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system with the 13th Amendment, one of the promises that was made to the African American community, this newly emancipated community, was what? It was 40 acres and a mule. Now, that promise was never intended to be kept, but what it did is it aligned your aspirations with the aspirations of white people. It was, I don't know about the mule, but the 40 acres were not theirs to give away, right? Those weren't their acres to give, but now that they promised them, it created an aspiration in this newly emancipated community to, again, whiteness needs to have someone to oppress to exist. And so if you emancipate enslaved peoples, you have a group of people raising up, you need to find a way to keep that sustained. And so by aligning your aspirations with that of the landowners, that is what kept the thing alive. And that's what also makes this challenging, because as I go around talking about land titles, I don't just get pushback from white people, right? I get pushback from African American communities and other minority communities, because they're like, hey, we just bought our first house, right? We finally are getting a piece of this dream. Yeah. And now you're talking about reevaluating the entire system.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have anything to say about that. That's actually right. There's nothing to say about it. But it's ironic that we say it now, and you're right. Like, most of us are fighting to try to get a one-bedroom with a washer and dryer in L.A. Like, we ain't looking at land. Like, we just want to be able to park and wash our clothes at home, okay? And possibly a dishwasher. Like, that's it. That's where we are in the world today. So, and it's funny because I just had this talk about how when we were, like, our parents, like, they bought their house. Some people, well, most people I knew had houses their parents bought, and they had all these things. And as time goes by, we get less and less of that, depending on where you live at. And so it's interesting because when you bring up the land thing, as far as, like, this is how we weed them out, I think it goes back to being suppressed. It's like that's that one spot that will always be on that different level for certain people. That's that one spot. Like, even to buy a house, you have to save a certain amount of money. You have to get approved for credit. You have to get all this stuff done. And there's only a certain percentage right now that will be capable of doing that. Yeah. Everybody else, good luck.
Yeah. And as I hear you talk, you're really educating me on things I didn't know before. So as I hear you talk, I'm like, I feel like Black people and Indigenous people need to be a little bit more cooler because we got some things in common. And I'm not talking about trauma bonding, but I'm just saying our history has been hidden. So even not just from ourselves, but from each other. It's just been so far hidden that I wouldn't know of the plight that the Indigenous.
Again, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
The way our nation has dealt with race has been in silos, right? We deal with African Americans here, we deal with Native people here, we deal with Latinx here, we deal with women here, right? Not just race, but all oppressed people. We do it in silos. And this is where my teaching on the doctrine of discovery is like, what it does is it kind of combines, shows the foundation of so much of this oppression. And again, this goes back to white supremacy, which is the belief that the white race believed they were God's chosen people, they were superior, and that's what gave them the right to enslave African Americans as well as to discover the lands of North Americans. And so that's where there's a lot of commonality between the plights of our groups, is we're wrestling against this notion of, this doctrine of discovery, which impacted both your peoples as well as my people, and the way that fed into the lie of white supremacy, which is rampant around the country.
You gotta realize too, like, depending on where you were raised at and who your family is, your, I guess, kinfolk, you look at it kind of differently, because for me, I knew that I was part Cherokee Indian. I didn't know too much about them. But if you go back, like you said, like, yes, they divided us, but at one point, apparently we all came together, because a lot of people who are of color are mixed with those two things. It's not said, you don't know for sure, but for most people, you know that you're mixed with it. Like, I was, like, I mean,
I ain't even gonna lie. I know there are a lot of people mixed with. I know there are a lot of people of color that are mixed with that. But I also know it's a lot of self-hatred just in being Black alone.
Yeah.
That people don't even like being Black no more. People
Yeah.
like, I mixed with this, I mixed with that, but some of that is like a lot of
like, I'm mixed with
self-hatred.
Indian. It's like, there's a joke that goes like that. But, and like, we've heard it from some people.
So
where
while
like,
I know it does exist, sometimes that's that self-hatred that's just indoctrinated.
You know, as you talk about the history and you know, recant some of what happened with white supremacy and the establishment of this country and the taking of whatever white, and it was predominantly white men, thought was just their right to take.
Yeah.
And their right to do this. It makes me think, how does that even happen to somebody? I mean, I'm not a white man, so I don't know how that thought would happen because I'm a white woman, but I can only imagine how something like that could even happen. And when you look at the sheer numbers of the population in this country is not majority white. No. And a lot of the oppression that happened was to control the larger population that was non-white. And what's fascinating as I'm listening to this is to think that while they had these people who, these white men who believed that they had the right to do this, to just come into a whole new land and set up as if it belonged to them, and then go take people from their home against their will and make people do something that they never chose to do. I mean, as I'm verbalizing this, I can't even believe that this has happened, and it continues to happen. The thing that is so bothersome is that it hasn't gone away. All of these centuries, it hasn't gone away. But I'm going to go back to what I started with saying. The white people are not the majority population. So how did that power get to be that power? It's that structure that
Yeah, you got it.
Yeah,
there you go.
Like that.
Yeah, but I
It's
mean,
Greek.
but to me, as I sit here and listen to all of this, I just think, I, how did we even get here? You know, how did we get to this place where?
The name of the church?
There are 4 chapters in my book on selling truths that are really compelling to people. Chapters 9 and 10, which lay out the mythology of Lincoln and how he was both a white supremacist and a genocidal president. The other 2 chapters are chapters 3 and 4, which are about how the church got from the teachings of Jesus, who said things like love your neighbors and pray for those who persecute you, to a doctrine of discovery that said you can kill people, enslave people who don't look like, act like, sound like, speak like you. And that journey in those 2 chapters over how we got from here to there in the course of 1,400 years centers around creating what is called the notion of Christian empire or Christian nationalism. And it's in creating that narrative, which is, again, so Western Europeans begin to co-opt this understanding of we're the new Israel. We have promised lands, right? We are blessed by God. And again, if you read the book of Joshua or Deuteronomy in the Bible, when God gave Israel promised lands, he told them to commit genocide throughout Canaan. Right? Leave no man, no woman, no child left alive. And so to this day, right, Benjamin Netanyahu was here in the United States in 2015 talking to a joint session of Congress. And Congress back then, just like today, was completely divided. Weren't even talking to each other. He had to somehow thread the needle. He was lobbying against the nuclear deal that President Obama was negotiating. And he said to our Congress, because America and Israel, we share a common destiny, the destiny of promised lands. Right? That's that narrative. That is what elevates whiteness to a divine hierarchy, which then gets perpetuated through the church, through the mythology of the history of the nation, and it gets bought and ingested and sewn into the fabric of the country.
I mean, I look at everything also, too, let's not forget, like, education, when it started, parishioners from church came to people who were mostly white to teach them the lesson, and you had to have money in order to get those lessons. It wasn't until later, after everything was unsegregated, that everything come together, but you go through different decades and generations of how that education was laid out to people. That's a part of it, too. You know, and it goes hand in hand what you're saying about church and religion. That's how it started with education.
I'm working on a second book right now. It's called Decolonizing Faith.
Ooh.
And the first book...
You're really going to get shouted at now.
The first book was really looking at our nation's history and the history of the church. And this book is looking... Basically, it's me as a Native man saying to the country and the church, this is what you told us. When you put us in your boarding schools, when you stole our land and committed genocide, this is what you told us about who you are, who your God is, and what we needed to do. And this book is me essentially saying, okay, I follow your religion, I've read your book, and I have a few questions. Because there's a lot of things where what you say and what your scriptures say don't match up. And there's a lot of ways where what you do, such as abuse your women and molest your children by your priests, is actually not that far off from what your God allows in the Old Testament.
The New Testament, the Old Testament.
And it's like, yeah, there's a few things. You're picking and choosing a few things, and you're using these scriptures and these teaching, these theologies, to keep both women and people of color oppressed. And we have to talk about this. And so my book it's called, I'm working on it right now, it's called Decolonizing Faith. And it really is addressing some of these things, because if we're going to ever have a conversation about our nation's history and what we want to do and where we want to go to move forward, we have to somehow find a way to separate church and state, which has been embedded since the foundings of this country. And if we can't do that, we're never going to become a nation where, as I said during my campaign in 2020, we the people actually means all the people, right? We're never going to become that if we can't figure out how do we separate these things which are written into the founding documents of our nation.
Well, thank you, Mark. And to everybody here, we have free copies of Mark's book out there in the lobby. And if you're watching, we can get you a copy of Mark's book, Unsettling Truths. And I think in the interest of time, we have to wrap it up. But I have about 10 things I'd like to say. But anybody that has stuff you want to say, hold on to them. It's been so great, and it has to be a great thing that we want to keep going. It feels like we could just keep talking. So thank you, Mark, for joining us, for coming back. Thank you so much, Jessica and Quentin. And thank you, Mary, for making it all possible. Anything you'd like to say in closing, Mary? Or?
I just feel like, again, today, just having this conversation, I learned so much. We are learning, and as long as we continue to learn and to grow and to have conversations and to understand each other and to listen to each other and to hear each other, we have the best chance of having community where we are.
This here is a memory. This here is a common memory for all of us. And that's, I think, where it starts. And I know there's a lot of apprehension that a lot of people have about jumping in, but I think we have to. Well, with that, and let's thank Jen Vaughn, our director. Thank you so much, Jen. And Jen, I think we'll skip the film. We were going to show you a short film from our department, but come to our final screenings, final cinema screenings Thursday and Friday night. And I'd just like to thank you all so much for joining us for our very first Candid Conversation here at LA City College, brought to you by the Committee for Race, Equity, and Social Justice. Stay tuned for monthly Candid Convos through the 2023 and 2024 school year as we welcome our new LACC president with open arms, Dr. Emmanuel Gabriel. We hope you've enjoyed this presentation and that there have been a few takeaways that will help you perhaps see things from a different point of view. So remember that it's okay to not have all the answers, but you can seek answers, you can listen, and you can ask questions. Thank you so much. Let's work together to bring our communities together, to speak truth to power, and more than anything, to take care of Mother Earth and all of our relatives. Thank you very much.